It is good to be back with you this week. I know things have just been a little crazy lately. First of all, I'd like to apologize for being here in Contagious 2 Sundays ago. I, you know, okay, I thought I had allergies and did not want to not fulfill my duties just because I had allergies. And then on my way home, I started feeling feverish and thought, well, this is a little more than allergies, and then turns out, yeah, it was COVID. So I apologize for subjecting any of you to that. That was never my intention, but I had to at least say that on the outset as we get back into it. I am no longer contagious, and I'll be honest with you, it really was not ever too bad on me. So thank God for that. I never got out of breath. I still have my taste and my smell, even though it may not sound like it too much. It mostly was just congestion. Do what? No, 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 no. And again, even our last class, even though there were differing views on, I guess that last argument, uh, I want to make no bones about it. I do not apologize for giving you that argument at all. I'm not sorry for that. Um, I don't want there to be any kind of I don't want to seem wishy-washy on it. I would not give you something I didn't think would be beneficial. Whether or not you view it as beneficial or something that you want to use, that is up to you. Again, I view this as a tool that you can use. There's a lot of tools, physical tools you have in your toolbox you may never use, but in a niche situation, you may need it. And that's why I wanted to present it to you. So, again, yeah, last class was very interesting. We'll put it that way. But hopefully, as we go forward, some of these things will be a little bit more straightforward. These are not going to be as abstract as maybe last class. It's definitely not going to be as abstract. But we're going to be getting into more of maybe what you thought this class was again on the outset. I wanted to start with the philosophical arguments so that you have some background. And I want to give you um, actually just a snippet of my week. There was actually somebody that's come to work as an intern, and that person sat in with me on my work for a day, and we got into a conversation, interestingly enough, about religion. She asked me, "Are you a religious person?" And I said, "Yes, I would consider myself a religious person." She goes, "That's really interesting." And she started asking me a few questions, and it became fairly obvious. And I asked her, I said, "Would you consider yourself an atheist?" She said, I would. I would consider myself that. And so we got into some conversations about science since, we're literally at a forensic lab. And so she had some questions about certain things. And we, you know, as I was getting work done, but at the same time, I would take the time off to have the conversation. I think it's that important. We went through almost every single a physical or not physical philosophical argument that we've gone over, and she said that I raised some really good points. I don't know if I've changed her mind necessarily. I don't know if you can change anybody's mind in one conversation, but I at least gave her something to think about. And she told me how much she enjoyed the conversation that she's had with me because she can obviously see that I'm a scientist and that I'm not somebody that's blindly believing what I believe. And that I brought some really interesting points up, and I'm not shying away from her questions. And so I only say that to you is that it can happen. And it literally just happened to me last week. I don't know if the timing was fortuitous, just as an example, to you guys, but I literally just had that conversation. She's going to be with us for the summer, and so hopefully she and I can continue to have some good conversations. But anyways, that's why, again, major purpose for this class. And so we're getting more into the study of science and quote unquote evolution. But this study is much more broad than just evolution. there's a whole lot more to what the atheistic worldview encompasses and that it has to encompass in order to support it. Okay. And so there's a few things that I really want to go over this morning as we introduce the idea. And again, I'm going to be introducing how we're going to go over this study, because there's a lot of complex concepts. There's a lot of really down in the weeds information we can get into. I don't want to necessarily overwhelm you. I want this to be a practical, usable class. So to do that, in the best way that I know how, I'm a tactile and visual learner. And a lot of times when we're talking about some of these things, it really helps to have a visual aid going along with it. And so that's why I've chosen Is Genesis History as a film, showing you segments of the film to go over certain topics that we're going to dive into a little more deeply to help with the visual portions of this. And so, again, really what this boils down to is a couple of worldviews, isn't it? It is our worldview that God created the world and everything that we see around us. And then there's a worldview where we've come to be what we are through natural processes, not a guided, unminded process by accidental and chaotic events. We've gotten to where we are. Again, one is that we have our earth, this universe has happened by chance, purely by physical processes with no design or guidance. The other is that a supreme being designed us and created us and everything around us. That is the truth. Again, I want this to be a study that is compelling, thought-provoking, and inspiring, because there's a lot of good evidence for what we believe. Again, I don't want you to think that all I have are just some logical arguments. While again, I think that they are really good when you get to use them in certain scenarios. But this is more tangible. This is something you can see. This is something you can actually use. This is observation of the world around us. It's very compelling. It gets you to think about certain things maybe you've never thought about before. And again, hopefully it is inspiring for you. Again, this is the film. We're going to watch the first chapter, and it's only about 10, 12 minutes long. But it's going to show us, we're not going to necessarily get right into evolution. I don't want you to think that we're not going to address that, because we absolutely are. But again, evolution is not the only thing that we have to address here. And I do have the link on YouTube. Is Genesis History actually has a channel, and they have the entire film for free viewership. So if this is a film that you want to go and watch on your own time, you actually don't have to buy it. It is actually on YouTube. So just wanted to go ahead and give you that if you wanted to watch it yourself. I have watched this film, I don't know how many times. I mean, I've used it as a teaching aid. And every time I've watched it, I pick up on something a little different. And it, almost blows my mind. I'm thinking, oh man, that is a great point. And so that's why I want to use this in conjunction with our study. I want to start off, though, by asking the question and really flushing this out. I want us to get in the right frame of mind as we go through this study, okay? What is science? And before you read that definition, and you may not even be able to read it because, again, I'm terrible with font size. I put that up as 32 font, and it still looks small. I'm sorry about that. But let me ask you this question. What is science? If you had to define it, what does science mean to you? And you don't necessarily have to say this answer out loud. Think about it for yourself. What does science mean to you? Have you ever actually looked up what science is, what the definition of it is? It's an interesting question. And I think once we understand what it is, it helps us understand what its limits are, what it can provide us. And that's an important thing to know. We need to know what the limits of science are so that when somebody says, well, science says, well, did science really say this? See, in my line of work, there are limits to what my science allows me to do. And if I go to the court of law and I testify beyond my limits, judge or the defense attorney is going to let me know real quick, right? As well they should. Same for us. If we go throughout the study, hopefully we can understand what it is, what it can allow us to know, what we can get through it, and what we can't. And I have this definition, and I like this definition. It's actually pretty close to the one that I've used and kind of come up with over the years. But this is from the Oxford Dictionary. It says science is the intellectual and practical activity of encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. There's a lot that's packed in there, okay? But this really encompasses what science is. Now, how many of you, when you thought, when I asked you to think of what science is, how many of you thought scientific method? Right? A few of you. I'm sure all of you at some point have been subjected to the scientific method, correct? Right? Scientific method in school? I'm sure you were. Here are the basic steps of what the scientific method is, okay? It starts with an observation, okay? And I've actually been asked, if what I do is science, how do you employ the scientific method? And so I'm going to use an example of a case, not an actual case. I'm not going to give you any details. But what I do, how I myself employ the scientific method, I make observations, okay? I've got, let's say, a gun, and I've got a bullet, okay? Well, that bullet, that seems to be the right caliber. Seems that it could have been fired through the barrel of the particular firearm that I've been given in this evidence, okay? Next step, I ask the question, could it have been? If I've got a bullet and I've got a gun, what's the question? Was it fired from this gun? That's the question I'm asking, okay? I come up with a hypothesis. Well, I think it is possible. Having my initial observations. Then I conduct an experiment. I get test fires from this gun. I go and I test it myself. I have knowns from my experiment. That's really important. I have standards of comparison. I know what that gun does to bullets because I've test fired them. Then I microscopically compare those bullets, my known bullets, to my unknowns. And if the same markings, that mechanical fingerprint that a gun leaves behind, that's left behind on the test fires, are on that evidence bullet from the body, then I can come to a conclusion that yes, that bullet was fired from that particular barrel. And my results, I will publish in my official report. So observation, asking a question, coming up with a hypothesis, experimentation, conclusions, and maybe even repeat if you need to repeat experimentation. But this is the general flow of what the scientific method is. And this is very adaptive to many different situations. I only give you the example that I gave you because it's what I'm used to. It's how I use the scientific method. But you can apply this to many different scenarios, okay? So I wanted to go over this first of all because I want us, when we look at the data that's going to be presented in this film, I want us to look at them through a scientific view. I want us to put our science caps on, or our, I guess, science or lab coats on, let's say that. Let's look at this as scientists. Let's look at this through a scientific view, okay? Don't be afraid of that. Don't be afraid to look, and I don't think anybody is afraid in here, but I think sometimes it's overwhelming to try to look at something that maybe you haven't studied very much. Or if you've maybe had an experience where it says, well, science says that your God doesn't exist and everything you believe is a sham. You might want to stay away from science. Well, science isn't saying that, a person is saying that. A person with a worldview and the application of science says it that way. That's a really important thing to consider, and that's really the first point I want to go through. Now, a portion of the film that we won't necessarily watch because I want to cover it right here before we even watch the first chapter is this idea that there are paradigms that we view certain things through. Okay, so a paradigm is a framework within in which that you interpret evidence. Okay, science isn't just about the evidence. Science doesn't exist in just a vacuum. There is an agent applying that science and viewing that science through a certain lens. Okay, that's what a paradigm means. And I'm sure some of you already know what a paradigm is. I assume a lot of you maybe even have used it. But for those of you that aren't familiar, again, when I use the word paradigm, I'm just saying framework or a lens that you view this through. And we have to understand, especially history, because that's really what's in question here. It's viewed through a certain paradigm. When you were in school, historically, what were you taught in science class? What happened back before we were really recording history? What were you taught? And this is something I want some interaction here. What were you taught about the world around us? Because some of you may actually have different experiences than maybe somebody my age. Maybe not. That's fair. That's fair. The world was flat. You know what's interesting is that there's actually been a group that's come back around that's really popularized that. And you know what's I saw, I guess you would call it a meme. I don't know. It was a picture of the solar system, our solar system, and you saw every other planet that's round, but ours was squared off and flat. So it was funny. But yeah, no, at a certain point, I mean, really back long ago, before we were able to employ maybe some of our scientific knowledge now, a flat Earth was what was believed. Yes. Yeah, because you asked that question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And very, very small, something, a single-celled organism is where we started. We got our beginnings from a single-celled organism. Okay, so yes, you probably got the same talk that we all got, or that we read in the textbooks. This a conventional worldview is the conventional paradigm. Okay, that we have a single-celled ancestor, that we all came from the exact same single-celled protozoa that was created in a primordial soup way back in the day. That's actually something we're going to cover again a little later, but we're actually going to start with rocks today. Oh, yep. Oh, there you go. I'm sorry.
I don't remember a lot about science in school either, but one thing that's always stuck in my mind was the theory. To me, the theory was not true unless you could prove it. And there are certain steps you had to do to prove something was true.
Well, and the word theory can be a little misleading just because of how many times a theory gets thrown out there and fact gets conflated with that word. Because look, you're exactly right. When we look at what the word theory means, you've gone through the scientific method, and you have, through many experiments, gotten what's the word I'm looking for here? You've got consistent results that uphold your hypothesis. Now, that theory has some backing behind it, but as one of my late professors has says, in science, there's nothing that's 100% fact. Can't 100% prove something. You could be 99.999% sure, but you can't really ever say 100% sure, which I thought was interesting. But yes, that theory doesn't necessarily say that it's fact, even though I think a lot of the language we get and the connotation, that tone that we get sometimes, is that you still don't believe in this. So well, even yourself have to say that it's what most likely happened. You can't say that it's fact, even though you're treating me as if it is fact. That's something that we do need to keep in mind, is that this hasn't been proven, and it can't be proven because we weren't there. If we look at the first step of the scientific method, it's observation. That's an important thing, because what we're talking about, none of us were there to observe, right? We weren't there to observe it. We weren't. Now, again, I want to go over these paradigms because it's important throughout this study when I refer to the conventional paradigm, what we mean by that. Yes.
You know, when I was growing up and studying with all the science that I was involved in, I always heard the phrase that science proves the Bible. So in reality, the Bible proves science. And you look at Leviticus as a perfect example of that. And science changes. I mean, you look at healthcare, look at the appendix. What we used to think the appendix was for, that is no longer the case. So science changes. What hasn't changed? You know, you look at Hebrews 13:8, where God hasn't changed, Jesus hasn't changed. Science changes, but the Bible doesn't.
You bring up a really good point. And really, you're getting to a point that's actually made towards the end of the study, but I'm glad you bring it up now because I think it's worth making. Science is relative to the information that you have. And see, the definition of science that I give, because I've been asked on the stand before, is you say that you're a forensic scientist. What is science? Well, that's a hard question to answer if you're really prepared to answer questions about your case. But it is a systematic approach to explaining observable phenomenon with a known amount of information. That's my definition of it, because your results change with more information, like you said. The appendix was viewed as a vestigial organ for a long time. Now, new science has come out, new observations come out that it may be actually home for good gut bacteria. It actually helps you with your gut health. And again, I've already stated that just because you can live without the organ doesn't make it a vestigial organ, a useless organ anymore. You can live without your eyes, nose, ears, arms, and legs. But does that make it vestigial? Absolutely not. I'd say your quality of life is going to go way down. And again, your coccyx, the tailbone, that's even been stated as vestigial. There's a lot of little muscles that connect to that bone that make it really hard to sit down if you don't have it. Make it really hard to walk if you don't have it. Again, there's a purpose for it. It doesn't make it vestigial. Again, it's people trying to fit something that can be observed through science into a worldview. Why would they want to do that? Why would you want to say the tailbone is vestigial? Well, it means because you came from your ancestors that had a tail. Now you're upright. You don't need the balance of the tail anymore, and it's just vestigial. It helps, again, justify what you believe, right? We need to take a step back. We need to look at the data, and we need to look at it as objectively as we possibly can so that we can choose which worldview best fits the data. And like you just said, science proves the Bible. Not necessarily at all. It really is that the Bible actually proves science, because when we look at the Genesis paradigm, see, these slides were made for a smaller classroom. You can't really see it, but Genesis paradigm shows really the 6 days of creation right here, and that's really what's being depicted here, okay? We have a worldview that God created everything. He created everything in 6 days. There was a worldwide flood. Do we view Genesis, do we view that book as history, as a historical document? Have you ever asked that question? Why is that question important?
evidence of a flood
Thank you.
in the
We're gonna
much
get-
world?
We're going to get into that here in just a moment. See, I want to show you certain things through this video that they do an amazing job with showing you pictures and videos of certain areas. If you look at the data, which is observable data, information that we gather, what actually explains what we see best. In the back. And so that's one of the questions. I mean, really, what we're starting to see is that these are diametrically opposed to one another. It's that 13.7, which is approximately 14 billion years ago. And really, it used to be actually, I think, 26 billion years, but they did some math and cut down, probably about 10 billion years off of that number. And see, science has changed a little bit there too. You got more information. Yeah.
If you don't say that right there is real, the Bible is lying.
Sure.
You don't say this is how it's created.
Well, see, and that's the importance of that question I just asked. Is Genesis an historical account, or is it a poetic account open for interpretation? Because I'll tell you, there isn't really just two options here. There's actually a third, and I think many people fall into it now, which I would say is the theistic evolution paradigm. A lot of people, a lot of Christians will say, well, the science says this, and I believe that God could have absolutely just kickstarted evolution and it happens exactly how the scientists say that it did. Anybody know anybody that believes that? And I'm not trying to call anybody out necessarily. Does anybody ran into people that believe that? You have? I would say there's probably somebody, if you talk to him long enough, you'd be surprised what they believe. And I think it's a retreat from really studying deep into what the data is and looking back at what the Bible says and seeing the comparison is really striking with how well the data fits the Genesis paradigm. Yes.
A lot of times with theistic evolution, they kind of pick and choose. They pick and choose the verses that they think prove what they're trying to prove as far as the Bible goes. And then they'll pick and choose from science. And I don't think we can take just the first 6 verses of Genesis and say, hey, if you don't believe this, you can't believe the Bible. There are so many other things in the Bible that you can believe. And I don't think we're ever instructed to take 1 or 2 verses and pick them out of context and saying, I can only believe this because of. I think you have to believe the whole Bible.
I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of people get in trouble by taking things out of context and looking at them again in a vacuum. You've got to have the context of the whole scripture. And again, really what we're trying to do here, do we believe in an actual 6-day creation event, 6 24-hour periods? Or do we believe in some, version of that? Again, Genesis is open to interpretation. These, a day can, a day is 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is a day. So these days that he's talking about could be eons of time that allowed evolution to occur. And this Genesis account is just more poetic in nature and is open to interpretation. I've heard that quite a bit.
Yeah, I know. It hadn't been, I guess, maybe 15 years ago. I've always heard millions of years and all that, and I've never really given a thought about the days, and how many thousand. And and all of a sudden I heard, all of a sudden, 6,000 years. The earth, we've been here 6,000 years. I just started hearing, that's 15 years ago. I mean, we really didn't get into that deep study of it and all. And I was always taught, like I said, in school, billions of years, dinosaurs are here, billions, I never really gave it a thought until we started studying this, that this is how many years, the earth has been around.
Well, and
Churches started studying, I think. It never
And we
really
need to.
started, yeah.
we really need to. And the consequences, again, it would be easier to say, look, science is science, religion is religion, and we're just going to keep it at that. It'd be the easy way out. But when we really start looking at it, if they're right, then there's some serious problems from what we get our truth from, right? We've got some serious conflictions between what Scripture says happened and what science says. And I think these are questions that need to be answered. One, that we're able to defend the faith that we have, that we actually better bolster our faith, that we know that the Bible is true. But again, how does it layer up and compare with the Bible when we actually look at the data? That's really important, because I think once we go through this and you see it through that lens, the data actually marries up better with the Genesis worldview than the conventional worldview of millions and millions of years. And I know that you brought up some time ago talking about radiometric dating and how we actually get those numbers. That's something we're going to address. And I will go ahead and let you know now, that one's going to be science heavy a little bit, just to give you fair warning on that. But I think it's something that I at least ought to share with you at some point, so you understand how those numbers are actually, or where they're coming from. So I'm looking down at the clock. It is 11:24, and I told you I've got 12 minutes of video to show you. I want to ask you a question. Would you like to start next week with the video, or do you want to go ahead and watch the 12 minutes now, and we can talk about it next week? Because I'm on slide 8 of 15. I've got material I can share, and we can actually start next week with the video. What sounds best to you guys? That sounds good. It really sounds good. Okay, that was what you were going to say? Okay. All right. Yes. Yes. Well, that's something we're going to get into. This is something that's actually discussed in this film. There's actually a Hebrew expert that Del Tackett's actually the narrator, the one that goes and asks a bunch of experts in their field about certain questions to address those issues. Because when you really think about what theistic evolution states, it's saying, well, they'll take a verse like, well, 1,000 years is a day to the Lord, and a day is 1,000 years. So do we apply that in the Hebrew to the days of the creation account? Well, when we look at the Hebrew, this is what we come up with. And spoiler alert, yes, there are 24-hour periods. That is exactly what the writer meant with the word yom. Yom is the Hebrew word for day. And again, he'll go on to say this in a little more detail. I'm no Hebrew expert. I'll just go ahead and say that. I have studied some Hebrew, and I've got a good friend back here that I think would be considered a Hebrew expert, Isaac. He's studied quite a bit of it. But when you look at the word yom, and again, I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of this now. When it's used in conjunction with a numerical value, it 100% means a 24-hour period. So when we look at Genesis and the statement at the end of each day, what does it say? And it was evening and morning of the first day. It was evening and morning of the second day. That denotes a 24-hour period. So the theistic evolutionist, that person that's living in that between world, they're actually going to have to now look at that scripture and say whether or not they're going to believe that. And see, that's really pointing more towards the Genesis paradigm. And again, it's coming out of Genesis. But when we look at the text portion of this, for those that are struggling as the Christian dabbling in with it, you present that to them and say, look, that's not what the scripture says. It's not open for interpretation. Yes?
The problem I've had with people that I have discussed this with, and they'll cut you right off at the front. I don't believe the Bible's just another book, you know.
Well, and see, so knowing where to start with folks is really important. And that was an idea I tried to introduce at the beginning of our study. Because if they don't believe in the Bible, that's okay. We have ways to discuss things. Because again, the young lady that I had a discussion with, which it was a very cordial one, we actually ended on a great note. She doesn't believe in the Bible. But I made her think about some things, through the logical arguments that I gave. But again, the cause and effect argument brought that up. And she says, I just can't get my head around something that's eternal. You believe, she asked me, she said, do you believe he's watching us right now? I said, yeah, I do. She goes, I just can't wrap my head around that. How do you wrap your head around something that's eternal like that? And I said, well, you got to believe something's eternal or something came from nothing. Those are really your only two options. So you really actually already, if you didn't think about it, you already believe that something's eternal or you believe something came from nothing. She objected to that at first. And then when we went through it, she said, you know what? That's right. Those are my only two options. And see, when we know how to use these arguments, you really can get somebody to, and again, I don't want this to be an argument. This needs to be a discussion because you're never going to get anywhere if you're trying to prove yourself right. And I look across this group of people, I don't see anybody that's trying to shove anything down anybody's throats or anything like that. So I don't think that's a worry. I just don't want there to be any idea that when I say argument, it isn't, we're getting into an argument. But you're right. It's really hard to have a discussion in the Bible when somebody doesn't respect or even, adhere to the authority of the Bible. They don't believe in it. When we look at this, though, you can say, hey, chapter 1, we're going to be going over rocks. We're going to go into the Grand Canyon. How were you taught back in the day how the Grand Canyon came to be? What was the cause of the Grand Canyon? The river. Millions of years of the Colorado River flowing through it and carving it out, right? I watched the Brady Bunch growing up, and I remember Papa Brady when they went out to the Grand Canyon, they had that trip. I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember him saying, now see there, kids? See the Colorado River? Over millions of years, it's carved out all that you see here. Interesting. We don't see that anywhere else in the U.S. where big rivers are going through land. Do we? The Mississippi's a lot bigger than the Colorado River. And what's really interesting, and what we're going to get into, those layers that we see in the Grand Canyon, they're not just in the Grand Canyon. Those strata, those layers of sedimentary rock actually span the entire U.S. and can be observed in other continents. What best explains why sedimentary layers have been laid like they have across continents? A flood. What best explains it? Again, I want us to look at this as objectively as we possibly can because I want you to come to this conclusion more in a scientific view. Which paradigm, which framework best explains the data that we see? Is it the conventional one that says millions and millions of years of an unguided, unminded process, or a designed, maybe way shorter time frame event and other events like the flood? There's good evidence for the flood. And the flood actually explains, just like this gentleman said right here, the Bible actually proves a lot of our scientific observations right, if we look through it that lens. We're going to get into, again, chapter 1 next week. There's that final bell. Thank you guys for your attention. I really think this is going to be beneficial, and I think you're really going to enjoy this film and what we're going to get into. So, any final comments or questions? Yes. Yep. We're going to get into the fossil record. We're going to get into dinosaurs. We're going to get into, like I said, it's not just evolution that we're going to get into. Yes. I'll have to look into that. Yeah, there's a few scriptures that actually talk about the Leviathan, some dinosaur-like animals for sure. And we see many fossils and bone graveyards of dinosaurs. You know where we find a lot of them? Out west and on very high areas. There's a graveyard of over 13,000 of a certain type of dinosaur, all gathered together on a pretty high precipice. Sounds like they were trying to get away from something. No. Again.
That was before the pressure within the earth. Since that time, pushed these bones up with the mountains around there on top of the mountain. They could have died down in the valley. And then the pressure within pushed these mountains up. Now the bones, the graveyards on top of the mountain.
Yeah.
That's what one of the rangers explained to us. I asked him, all these entangled bones of all different types of dinosaurs are way up here. I said, why aren't they way down here in the valley? She said, well, they probably died in the valley. They probably got entangled somehow or another. They came down of dinosaur bodies and skeletons. And then since that time, the pressure within has formed the Rocky Mountain, which makes some sense.
They either died down there, or they ran up to the top, or they floated up.
And see, that's it. We can take a hypothesis like that, look at it with the data. Does it make more sense that occurred, even though, first of all, we really weren't there to observe these mountains being pushed up from a valley, and a valley denotes that there were two mountains on the other side, so something up from it. And maybe you don't mean just valley, maybe just a lower lying area. Let's just say that. That tectonic plate movement has pushed up. And look, there have been mountains that have gotten higher over the years. That is true. But again, overall, it seems as if you're trying to put the data in a framework that works for your worldview. Does it best explain what happens across all of these overlying areas? And again, if we tested rocks from that mountain, and it comes back to, do the dating methods actually occur, simultaneous with the dinosaur fossils? And that's something we're going to get into as well. There's some really interesting, I'll just put it that way, ways that people come up with dates, because dating methods can't be done on every single rock, and there are reasons for that. That was actually something that really surprised me when I got into the radiometric dating methods. But again, that's something you can choose to believe. I don't know if there's great evidence to believe that, yes, tectonic plate movement pushed all of this up and carried fossils in a uniformed way up to a higher elevation. Again, there's no way for me to say, well, that couldn't have, because I wasn't there when they say it happened. But I think it's probably better explained that all of these animals, and again, even if they did get pushed all the way up, all of them died at the same moment. That's something to think of. Some catastrophic event happened where all of these things died in the same area, and they were in conditions where they could be fossilized. That's another thing. If a comet hits them, that's not conditions for fossilization. You have to have a lot of water in very specific situations where fossilization can occur. That's why we don't have a bunch of fossils laying around of everything that's ever died. Why do you think we see a lot of seashell fossils? Because these are aquatic animals in aquatic environments where fossilization can actually occur more readily. That would be my answer to that, is that it still doesn't answer why they were all fossilized in the first place. What event occurred to get them to die all together and be fossilized together? So again, I think it still points back to a flood.
There's a ridge just south of Belfast,
Mm-hmm.
big ridge, and I knew two landowners just over the ridge, and they have huge fossil collections.
Yeah.
And that's still it's kind of up, it's not on top, but it's kind of up high.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an amazing amount of fossils, but we should have a whole lot more if everything could be fossilized really easily, don't you think? Yeah. But we're going to get into that a little more. If that's everything, if you have some more questions or comments, come find me. I'm not contagious now, per the CDC. But we can talk anytime you like. But we'll go ahead and end class with a prayer. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for, again, your wonderful creation, the evidence that you've provided for us, and again, your wonderful word that helps guide us in our studies, in our observations. Lord, help us, again, to look at things the way that you would have us to view them. And again, help us in our conversations, in our attempts to evangelize, to have a ready defense so that we bring more souls to you. Lord, we're so truly blessed. We have so many things that you've given to us. Help us to be good stewards of our blessings. Help us to, again, build up your kingdom with them. Be with those who are struggling, that are sick, that have emotional or physical ailments. Lord, I pray that you be with them and help them through those times. Lord, again, we're so thankful for all the things you've given us, but we're most thankful for your Son, the ultimate sacrifice that he gave, the ultimate gift that we enjoy, that gives us hope of eternal salvation. Lord, we're so thankful for him, and we ask this all in Jesus' most high and matchless name. Amen.